I was born in a small mountain town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep. My name is Emma Richardson, and for most of my childhood, I lived in a cramped trailer with my mother, Linda, who worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. My father had left before I could even remember his face, and my mother never spoke about him except to say he wasn't worth the breath it took to curse his name. We were poor, the kind of poor where you wear the same pair of shoes until your toes poke through the front, and dinner was sometimes just bread and butter. But my mother had pride, the kind that kept her back straight even when the world tried to bend her in half. When I was 7 years old, my mother received a letter that changed everything, or so we thought at the time. It was from a lawyer's office 2 towns over, written in that formal language that made my mother squint and reread every line twice. The letter explained that a distant relative, someone my mother had never mentioned, had passed away and left us a piece of land. 20 acres on the far side of the mountain, tucked away where the roads turned to gravel and the trees grew so thick you could barely see the sky. My mother cried when she read it, not sad tears but the kind that come when you've been holding your breath for so long you forgot what it felt like to breathe. We drove out to see the property on a Saturday morning, our old truck coughing black smoke as it climbed the winding mountain roads. The land was more remote than I had imagined, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. When we finally arrived, my heart sank. The property was overgrown with weeds and wild brambles, and sitting in the middle of it all was an old barn, its red paint peeling and faded to a dull rust color. The structure leaned slightly to one side, as if it might collapse with the next strong wind. My mother stood there for a long time, hands on her hips, staring at the barn with an expression I couldn't quite read. We couldn't afford to build anything on the land, not with the little money we had, so the property just sat there, a dream deferred. My mother talked about it sometimes, late at night when she thought I was asleep, whispering plans to herself about what we could do if we ever had the means. But years passed and nothing changed. I grew up, graduated high school, and moved to the city for college, leaving my mother behind in that trailer. The land became something we didn't talk about anymore, just another reminder of opportunities we couldn't afford to take. Then 20 years later, my mother got sick. Cancer, the doctor said, and it had already spread too far by the time they found it. She fought it for 8 months, but in the end, the disease won. I held her hand as she took her last breath, and in that moment, I felt more alone than I ever had in my entire life. After the funeral, I found myself driving back to that old property. I don't know what compelled me to go there. Maybe it was grief, or maybe I just needed to feel close to my mother again. The land looked exactly as I remembered it, wild and untouched, with that same old barn still standing, impossibly defiant against time. I parked the truck and walked through the tall grass, my boots crunching on fallen branches and dried leaves. The barn doors were rusted shut, but with some effort I managed to pry them open. The hinges screamed in protest, and the smell of old wood and decay hit me like a wave. Inside, the barn was dark and filled with shadows. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of sunlight that broke through gaps in the walls. There were old farming tools scattered around, covered in rust and cobwebs, and stacks of rotting wood that might have once been furniture. I was about to leave when something caught my eye in the far corner. It was a tarp, faded and covered in years of grime, draped over something large. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over, grabbing the edge of the tarp and pulling it back. What I saw underneath made my breath catch in my throat. It was a car, but not just any car. Even under all the dust and dirt, I could see the sleek curves and chrome detailing of what looked like a vintage automobile. My heart started racing as I circled around it, wiping away layers of grime with my sleeve. The more I uncovered, the more beautiful it became. It was a 1967 Shelby Mustang, painted in a deep blue that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. I had seen enough car shows with my ex-boyfriend to recognize something valuable when I saw it, and this was beyond valuable. This was a collector's dream. My hands were shaking as I opened the driver's side door. The interior was surprisingly intact, with leather seats that were cracked but not destroyed. On the passenger seat was an old envelope, yellowed with age. I picked it up carefully and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note, the ink faded but still legible. It read, "To whoever finds this, I hope it brings you the fortune I never had. Take care of her. She deserves better than rotting in this barn." It was signed with a name I didn't recognize, probably the distant relative who had left us the land. I spent the next hour just sitting in that car, trying to process what I had found. This vehicle could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe even more if it was in good condition mechanically. It was the kind of money that could change a life, the kind of money my mother had worked herself to death hopping for, and here it had been, sitting in this barn the entire time, just waiting to be discovered. I felt a strange mix of emotions, excitement, sadness, and anger all tangled together. Why hadn't we known about this sooner? Why had my mother died poor when this fortune was sitting right here? But there was no time for regrets. I needed to figure out what to do next. I took dozens of photos of the car from every angle and then carefully locked the barn back up. I drove straight to the nearest town and found a mechanic who specialized in vintage cars. His name was Frank Delgado, a man in his 60s with grease-stained hands and a passion for automobiles that was evident in the way his eyes lit up when I showed him the photos. Frank agreed to come out to the property the next day to assess the car. When he saw it in person, he let out a low whistle. "This is the real deal," he said, running his hand along the hood. "Needs some work, but the bones are solid. You're sitting on a gold mine here, young lady." He estimated that with proper restoration, the car could fetch anywhere from $400,000 to $600,000 at auction, maybe more if we found the right buyer. I could barely comprehend those numbers. That was more money than my mother had earned in her entire lifetime. But getting the car out of the barn and into a condition where it could be sold was going to be a challenge. Frank offered to help with the restoration in exchange for a small percentage of the final sale, and I agreed. Over the next few months, we worked tirelessly. Frank brought in parts, some original and some carefully sourced reproductions, and slowly the Mustang began to come back to life. I spent every weekend at the property, helping where I could and learning more about cars than I ever thought possible. During this time, word began to spread in the small town about what I had found. At first, people were excited for me, congratulating me on my good fortune. But then things started to change. A man named Gerald Hopkins, who owned several properties in the area and was something of a local big shot, started showing up at the barn unannounced. He was in his 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The first time he visited, he was friendly enough, asking questions about the car and expressing interest in the property. "That's quite a find you've got there," Gerald said, leaning against his expensive truck. "Must be overwhelming trying to figure out what to do with all this." I told him I was handling it, but he persisted. "You know, if you ever want to sell the land, I'd be happy to make you an offer. I've been looking to expand my holdings in this area." I politely declined, telling him I hadn't made any decisions yet. He smiled, but there was something cold in his expression. "Well, you just let me know if you change your mind." After that, Gerald became a regular presence. He would drive by the property slowly, sometimes stopping to watch us work on the car. It made me uncomfortable, but Frank told me not to worry about it. "Guys like him always want what they can't have," he said. "Just ignore him." But ignoring Gerald became impossible when he started making legal moves. One day, I received a letter from his lawyer claiming that there was a dispute over the property boundaries, and that part of the land, including the barn, actually belonged to Gerald's adjacent property. The letter demanded that I cease all activities on the disputed land immediately and threatened legal action if I didn't comply. I was furious. I contacted my own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Green who had helped me with my mother's estate. Patricia reviewed the property documents and assured me that the claim was baseless. "This is a common tactic," she explained. "He's trying to intimidate you into selling. Don't let him bully you." She sent a strongly worded response to Gerald's lawyer, and for a few weeks, things went quiet. but I could feel the tension building. Gerald wasn't the type of man who gave up easily. The harassment escalated. Someone cut the lock on the barn door, though nothing was stolen. Then my truck's tires were slashed while it was parked at the property. The local sheriff, a friend of Gerald's, seemed uninterested in investigating. "Probably just kids," he said with a shrug when I filed a report. I knew it wasn't kids. This was Gerald trying to drive me away. Frank suggested we install security cameras, and we did, hiding them in the trees around the barn. If Gerald or anyone working for him tried something again, we'd have evidence. Sure enough, a week later, the cameras caught someone trying to break into the barn at night. The footage was grainy, but I could make out a figure in dark clothing using bolt cutters on the new lock I had installed. I couldn't see the person's face, but I recognized the truck parked nearby. It was one of Gerald's work vehicles. I took the footage straight to Patricia, who advised me to take it to the state police since the local sheriff couldn't be trusted. The state police were far more interested than the local authorities had been. They opened an investigation into Gerald's activities, and suddenly, the harassment stopped. Meanwhile, the restoration of the Mustang was nearly complete. Frank had worked miracles, and the car looked absolutely stunning. We decided to auction it through a prestigious classic car auction house that specialized in rare vehicles. The auction house sent a representative to inspect the car, and they were thrilled. "This is going to generate a lot of interest," the representative said. "We'll make sure it gets the attention it deserves." They scheduled the auction for 2 months out, giving them time to market the car properly. During those 2 months, I started receiving offers to buy the car privately, some of them quite substantial. But Patricia advised me to stick with the auction, believing we'd get a better price that way. Gerald made one last attempt to interfere, filing an injunction claiming that the car was part of the disputed property and therefore couldn't be sold. But the judge threw out the injunction almost immediately, citing the previous ruling that confirmed my ownership of the land. Gerald was running out of options, and he knew it. The night before the auction, I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about my mother, about how different our lives could have been if we had known about the car sooner. But I also felt grateful. This discovery was giving me a chance to honor her memory, to take the struggles she had endured and turn them into something meaningful. When I finally did fall asleep, I dreamed of her, young and healthy, smiling at me with pride. The auction took place in a large convention center in the city, packed with collectors and enthusiasts from around the country. The Mustang was displayed on a rotating platform under bright lights, looking like a piece of art. When the bidding started, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The bids climbed quickly, surpassing Frank's estimates within minutes. 200,000, 300,000, 400,000. The auctioneer's voice was rapid-fire, calling out numbers that seemed surreal. Finally, the bidding slowed and the hammer came down at $575,000. I had to sit down. I couldn't believe it. Frank was grinning from ear to ear, and Patricia gave me a hug. "You did it," she said. "Your mother would be so proud." After the auction house took their commission and Frank received his agreed-upon percentage, I walked away with just over $460,000. It was more money than I had ever imagined having, and the first thing I did was pay off my student loans and the medical bills from my mother's treatment. Then I set up a scholarship fund in her name for kids from low-income families in our hometown. I wanted to make sure that other children like me, who grew up poor but full of dreams, would have a chance to pursue their education without the burden of debt. As for Gerald Hopkins, karma had its own plans for him. The state police investigation into his activities uncovered a pattern of intimidation and fraudulent property claims targeting other landowners in the area. He was charged with multiple counts of harassment, attempted fraud, and conspiracy. His reputation in the community was destroyed, and several of his business ventures collapsed as partners distanced themselves from him. The last I heard, he had moved out of the area entirely, unable to face the shame of his downfall. I felt no satisfaction in his suffering, only relief that he could no longer hurt anyone else. I kept the mountain property. I hired a contractor to restore the barn and turned it into a workshop where local artists and craftspeople could rent space to work on their projects. It became a little hub of creativity, exactly the kind of thing my mother would have loved. I visit often, walking through the tall grass and remembering the day I pulled back that tarp and found the car that changed my life. Sometimes I sit in the barn, now filled with light and the sound of people creating, and I feel my mother's presence. I like to think she's proud of what I've done, proud that I took the gift she unknowingly left me and used it to build something good. The experience taught me that fortune can hide in the most unexpected places, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. It also taught me that resilience runs deeper than circumstance, that the strength my mother showed in the face of hardship lived on in me. I carry her memory with me every day, not as a weight but as a source of light, guiding me forward. The mountain property that once represented deferred dreams now stands as a testament to hope, to the idea that it's never too late for things to change, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in what we inherit, but in what we choose to do with it. Years have passed since that discovery, and my life is unrecognizable from what it once was. I still work, not because I have to, but because I want to. I've started a nonprofit that helps families in financial crisis, providing resources and support to people who feel like they're drowning in debt and desperation. Every person I help, I see my mother's face, and I'm reminded of why this work matters. The money from the Mustang gave me financial security, but it was the journey of fighting for what was rightfully mine that gave me purpose. I think about Gerald sometimes, about the desperation that must have driven him to try and steal from someone who had so little. In a way, I pity him. He had wealth and status, but it was never enough. He needed more, always more, and in reaching for what wasn't his, he lost everything that was. My mother taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars but in dignity, in kindness, in the legacy you leave behind. By that measure, she was the richest person I've ever known, and I strive every day to be worthy of her example. The old barn on the mountain stands as a monument to her memory, a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope endures, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look for it.